Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story.
On a humid June morning in 2007, cameras crowded the corridors of Chicago's federal courthouse. Reporters leaned over metal barricades, microphones outstretched, waiting for a glimpse of a man whose name had hovered over the city's underworld for half a century. When Joseph "Joey the Clown" Lombardo finally appeared, he did not look like the figure described in prosecutors' files. No longer the feared power broker of the Chicago outfit, but a 78-year-old with thinning white hair, thick glasses, and a shuffle in his step. Yet the charges read out in court reached back across decades: racketeering, extortion, and murders connected to one of the most durable criminal organizations in American history. As the family secrets trial began, jurors would hear about hidden graves, casino money skimmed from Las Vegas, and union pension funds quietly drained of millions. Amid this, Lombardo, with the same peculiar humor that had earned him his nickname, tried to crack jokes and wave to the press. To some, it seemed like a performance. To others, a final act in a life shaped by forces far larger than one man. To understand how a child of immigrant Chicago ended up at the center of such a story, we have to leave the fluorescent lights of the courtroom behind and return to the narrow streets where his life began. Joseph Lombardo was born on January 1, 1929, in Chicago, at the dawn of a year that would become synonymous with economic collapse. The stock market crash that October would plunge the United States into the Great Depression. But even before that, families like the Lombardos lived on the edge of poverty. His parents were Italian immigrants, part of a wave that had crossed the Atlantic in the early 20th century, trading the hills and villages of southern Italy for the crowded tenements and factories of American cities. Chicago's near west side, where he grew up, was a patchwork of ethnic enclaves: Italians, Greeks, Jews, and later Mexican and black families, each clustered in tight neighborhoods and tied together by parish churches, mutual aid societies, and the daily struggle to make rent. In these blocks west of the Loop, brick apartment buildings hugged the sidewalks, and laundry lines stretched between back porches. Men left home before dawn to work on construction crews, in foundries, in rail yards. Women took in sewing or washing, or worked behind bakery counters and in small groceries. Children learned early that money was fragile, that a layoff or an illness could undo everything. For Italian families, the Catholic parish was a central institution, offering not just religious guidance but a measure of social stability. Baptisms, first communions, and feast days marked the calendar. Yet even amid this network of support, discrimination against Italian immigrants was common. They were often seen by the wider city as outsiders, stereotyped as prone to violence or criminality even when they were simply trying to survive. That stereotype had roots in something very real: the conspicuous presence of organized crime in Italian neighborhoods. During Joseph's earliest years, prohibition was still in effect, and Chicago was known worldwide as the city of Al Capone. The newspapers carried breathless stories about gangland shootings, bootlegging empires, and brazen corruption. But for many residents of the near west side, organized crime was not just a sensational headline. It was part of the local landscape. It might be the bar on the corner where certain men held quiet meetings, the bookmaker who took bets in the back of a candy store, or the connected figure who could get a relative a job or resolve a dispute that the official system ignored. Children absorbed these realities without necessarily understanding them. There is no detailed record of what the young Joseph thought as he watched the men who came and went on his block, but he grew up in a place where the boundaries between legitimate authority and underground power were conspicuously blurred. By the time he was old enough to form lasting memories, the loudest chapter of the Capone era had ended. In 1931, Capone was sent to federal prison for tax evasion, and a quieter, more corporate class of mob bosses took control. Under Frank Nitti, Paul Ricca, Tony Accardo, and later Sam Giancana, the outfit that had grown rich on bootleg liquor diversified into gambling, labor racketeering, and loan sharking. Violence did not disappear, but it became less visible, more carefully managed. For a kid in a working-class Italian neighborhood, this meant that the underworld's presence was still felt, even if it didn't always announce itself with the sound of gunfire. Certain people's names were spoken carefully. Certain businesses were understood to be protected. When politicians came around at election time, they tended to know exactly which men to greet first. The public record tells us relatively little about Joseph Lombardo's day-to-day childhood. There are no memoirs, no diary entries, no childhood photographs that made their way into history books. What we have instead are fragments, census records that place his family in crowded housing on the West Side, school enrollment figures that show a boy of Italian parentage attending local public schools, and much later, FBI summaries compiled when he was already a suspect, sketching his background in a few terse lines. These records are consistent about one thing: his family's economic status. They were not part of the small Italian middle class of shop owners and professionals. They were at the lower end of the working class, scraping by through manual labor in a city that was itself struggling to emerge from the Depression. Growing up in those conditions during the 1930s meant constant negotiation between hope and constraint. On one hand, New Deal programs brought some relief: public works projects, school lunch programs, and occasional jobs for fathers or older brothers through agencies like the Works Progress Administration. On the other hand, unemployment remained high, wages were low, and eviction was a looming threat. For children on the West Side, the streets were both playground and classroom. They learned how to navigate ethnic boundaries, how to avoid trouble with older boys, and how to read the moods of policemen who might view them with suspicion, simply because of where they lived and how they looked. Social historians of Chicago's immigrant neighborhoods describe informal peer groups that sometimes hardened into street gangs, often organized block by block or parish by parish. These groups were not necessarily connected to organized crime, but they created an environment in which toughness and loyalty were highly valued traits. School offered a different kind of education. In crowded classrooms, children of immigrants were expected to learn English, pledge allegiance to the American flag, and adopt the customs of their new country. Teachers sometimes changed students' names to sound more American, or discouraged the use of Italian at home. For a boy like Joseph, this meant growing up at the intersection of two worlds: the traditional culture of his parents, with its emphasis on family honor, obedience, and the authority of the church, and the increasingly Americanized culture of his peers, shaped by radio shows, movies, and the fast-talking newsreel heroes of the 1930s and 1940s. For many in his generation, this tension created both opportunity and disorientation. The United States promised social mobility, but the path upward was not evenly accessible. As Lombardo entered his teenage years, the United States was pulled into World War II. Chicago's factories roared to life, producing steel, machinery, and war materiel. The war economy transformed the city's labor market, drawing women into industrial work and giving many young men jobs in plants and warehouses. For West Side families, this meant that for the first time in years, steady paychecks were available, if one could get hired. Teenagers often lied about their age to work in machine shops or on loading docks, and some dropped out of school to bring in income. Later summaries of Lombardo's life compiled by law enforcement would list early employment in blue-collar positions: truck driver, machinist, parking lot attendant. These kinds of jobs were typical stepping stones for working-class youth in mid-century Chicago, providing modest wages but little long-term security. The war years also changed the structure of organized crime, even if those changes were not always visible at street level. Outfit leadership, aware that increased federal scrutiny came with wartime conditions, continued its shift from conspicuous violence to more systematic control of gambling, labor unions, and construction. West Side territories like the one where Lombardo grew up fell under the influence of crews that answered to higher-ups such as Tony Accardo and, later, Giancana. Illegal gambling dens operated quietly behind legitimate storefronts. Bookmakers took bets on horse races and sporting events from industrial workers flush with overtime wages. In this climate, younger men from neighborhood families were sometimes drawn into low-level roles, acting as lookouts, delivering envelopes, or collecting small debts. Decades later, in court testimony and FBI reports, investigators would describe this pattern as a common pathway by which local youths became, over time, trusted associates of the outfit. When trying to reconstruct Lombardo's personal path, historians are limited by the secrecy that surrounded the outfit and by Lombardo's own lifelong refusal to cooperate with authorities. What is known is that, by the late 1940s, his name began to appear in law enforcement records. These early references, preserved in FBI files and Chicago police indexes, connect him to property-related offenses, charges involving theft or receiving stolen goods. The details of individual cases are often sparse, and some early arrests did not result in conviction, a common outcome in an era when witness intimidation and political influence could quietly shape courtroom proceedings. But the appearance of his name in these contexts indicates that he was moving beyond the ordinary world of low-wage employment and into a shadow economy where goods and money changed hands outside the law. The wider social context helps explain why such a shift might have seemed attractive, or at least understandable, to someone in Lombardo's position. Post-war Chicago was booming on the surface. Veterans were returning. The GI Bill was opening some doors to higher education and homeownership, and new housing developments were spreading into the suburbs. Yet for many families on the near West Side, these opportunities remained just out of reach. Discriminatory practices in lending, real estate, and employment made it harder for Italian and other ethnic minority families to move into certain neighborhoods or secure certain jobs. The factories that had offered wartime work were beginning to automate or relocate. For someone with limited formal education, the prospect of earning money quickly, whether through gambling operations, fencing stolen goods, or working as an enforcer for local loan sharks, could be a powerful temptation. It is important not to romanticize this world. Organized crime was not a glamorous alternative economy. It was a system that profited from addiction, debt, fear, and, when necessary, intimidation and violence. For the small circle of men at the top, it could bring wealth and influence. For those lower on the ladder, it often meant risk without long-term security. Lombardo's early appearance in police records suggests he was operating at this lower level at first, testing the boundaries of what he could get away with in a city where corruption was deeply entrenched. Chicago's political machine, dominated by the Democratic Party, relied on neighborhood fixers who could turn out votes and keep order. In Italian neighborhoods, these fixers often overlapped with figures tied to the outfit. The message young men received, implicitly or explicitly, was that power did not reside only in City Hall or the police station. It also lived in the social clubs, taverns, and backrooms controlled by men whose authority did not come from elections or official titles. Within this environment, Lombardo developed a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life. A capacity for humor, and an ability to project affability even in tense situations. While specific childhood anecdotes are scarce, later accounts from law enforcement officials and attorneys describe him as someone who tried to disarm opponents with jokes, who smiled for mugshots, and who seemed to relish playing the role of the clown. This persona, which would become widely known during his high-profile trials in the 1970s and 2000s, had its roots in the social dynamics of the neighborhoods where he grew up. In crowded immigrant communities, quick wit and a talent for making others laugh were currencies of their own, allowing someone to navigate social hierarchies and diffuse conflict. But humor could also be a shield, a way to obscure seriousness of purpose and to make others underestimate one's resolve. Behind that outward persona, the structural forces shaping Lombardo's world were becoming more rigid. By the early 1950s, the Chicago outfit had fully transitioned from its Prohibition-era origins into a diversified criminal enterprise with tentacles in construction, trucking, unions, and casino gambling in other states. Higher-ups had learned that control over unions and pension funds could be as profitable, and often safer, than bootlegging or street-level extortion. On the West Side, this translated into a growing connection between neighborhood crews and certain locals of major labor unions. Though Lombardo would later be linked to schemes involving Teamsters' pension money and Las Vegas casinos, in his youth he was still, according to surviving records, operating at the margins of this larger machine, close enough to be useful, not yet elevated to formal leadership. As he moved through his 20s, the pattern of his life, as far as it can be reconstructed from arrest records and later testimonies, shows a man orbiting the outfit's West Side operations. The Grand Avenue Crew, named for one of the major east-west arteries cutting across the city, emerged as a key unit within the outfit's structure, controlling gambling, loan sharking, and various rackets in its territory. Years later, FBI and court documents would identify Joseph Lombardo as one of the central figures of this crew. But that status was not bestowed overnight. In earlier years, it would have been necessary to prove reliability, handling tasks quietly, demonstrating discretion, and showing a willingness to enforce decisions without drawing undue attention. At the same time, Lombardo's personal life proceeded in ways that were, on the surface, unremarkable for a man of his background and era. Public records show that he married and raised a family, maintaining a household that, outwardly, could have passed for any other working-class Italian-American home in Chicago. Neighbors in such communities were often reluctant to speak openly about the activities of men rumored to be connected to the outfit. Silence was a form of self-protection, and for many, the details of who did what beyond the block were neither entirely known nor entirely mysterious. Children went to school, families attended mass, and on weekends there were weddings, baptisms, and neighborhood festivals. All the while, a parallel system of power operated in the background, influencing which construction companies won contracts, which bars got licenses, and which disputes were settled without ever reaching a courtroom. By the middle of the 20th century, the forces that had shaped Lombardo's early life, immigrant struggle, economic inequality, entrenched political corruption, and the enduring presence of the Chicago outfit, had combined to create a particular kind of opportunity structure for men like him. Legitimate paths to influence and security were narrow, especially for those without advanced education or connections outside the neighborhood. Illicit paths, though dangerous, offered quicker results and a sense of belonging to something larger than oneself. This does not excuse the harms that would later be laid at Lombardo's feet, but it does situate them in a broader context. He was not an isolated aberration, but a product of a city where, for generations, organized crime had flourished alongside official institutions, often in quiet partnership with them. As the 1950s unfolded, law enforcement agencies at the local and federal levels began to look more closely at the mafia and at the Chicago outfit in particular. Congressional hearings, nationally, televised investigations, and new federal laws signaled a shift from the relative acceptance of organized crime as a fact of life to a more concerted, if uneven, effort to dismantle it. For Lombardo, still moving from the edges toward the center of outfit activity, this changing landscape would mean that each decision carried greater risk. The boy who had grown up in the shadow of Prohibition-era legends was now entering adulthood at a time when the Underworld was adapting to new pressures, seeking new sources of income, and tightening its internal discipline. The stage was set for him to rise from neighborhood operator to recognized power within the outfit's hierarchy, a rise that would eventually draw national attention, and decades later, bring him back into the harsh lights of the federal courtroom where our story began. In the first years after World War II, the city that had shaped Joseph Lombardo's childhood was changing in ways that were both visible and invisible. New expressways sliced through old neighborhoods. Veterans came home, started families, and looked for work. Factories, still humming from wartime production, promised a version of stability that earlier generations of immigrants had rarely known. On Chicago's near West Side, where Lombardo had grown up among brick tenements and corner taverns, some families finally managed to move a few miles west, into slightly larger apartments or small bungalows. Others stayed, watching as housing projects rose and long-standing ethnic boundaries slowly shifted. For a young man in his late teens and early 20s, the question was what kind of life to build in this unsettled but hopeful landscape. Lombardo, like many of his contemporaries, stepped into adulthood with limited formal education and immediate financial pressures. Public records and later law enforcement summaries place him in a series of blue-collar jobs, driving trucks, working around construction sites, doing the kinds of hard, unglamorous labor that kept the city's economic engine turning. These jobs brought in a paycheck, but they did not erase the precariousness he had known since childhood. Layoffs were common. Injuries could end a career overnight. In the crowded taverns and union halls of the West Side, older men were blunt about the limits of such work. You could break your back for 30 years and still find yourself one bad winter away from losing everything. In that environment, the parallel economy run by the Chicago outfit did not appear only as a dark underworld. To some, it looked like an alternate ladder of advancement, one that operated by its own rules and promised a different kind of security to those willing to climb it. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, law enforcement files suggest that Lombardo was already on the radar of Chicago police. The details of these early encounters remain fragmentary. Brief notations in arrest logs, mentions in FBI background reports compiled years later. They point to the kinds of offenses common among young men who moved on the edges of the outfit's enterprises: property-related crimes, questions about stolen goods, suspicion of involvement in illegal gambling. In many cases, charges were reduced or dismissed. Witnesses grew suddenly uncooperative. Paperwork seemed to go missing. This pattern, familiar to anyone studying mid-century organized crime in Chicago, was less a testament to extraordinary luck than to the tight web of influence that the outfit had woven through portions of the local police and court systems. For a young associate, each encounter with the law became a test, not only of personal nerve, but of whether more powerful men considered him worth protecting. To understand what Lombardo was stepping into, it is necessary to consider the outfit's structure at the time. After Capone's imprisonment and the violent turmoil of the 1920s, a more discreet generation of leaders, Paul Ricca, Tony Accardo, and their lieutenants, had transformed the old bootlegging mob into a diversified criminal corporation. The city was divided into unofficial territories, each overseen by a crew. These crews oversaw gambling operations ranging from neighborhood card games to large-scale sports betting. They lent money at steep rates. They extorted insurance payments from businesses. And increasingly, they infiltrated labor unions and construction firms. The West Side, including the area around Grand Avenue, fell under the influence of outfit figures who prized a low profile and steady profits over headline-grabbing violence. Within these crews, young men might begin on the periphery, running errands, delivering sealed envelopes, serving as lookouts, before proving themselves reliable enough for more sensitive tasks. By the mid-1950s, federal agencies were starting to pay closer attention to organized crime nationwide, but on a day-to-day level, the outfit still operated with remarkable freedom in Chicago. Gambling dens could be found behind unmarked doors, in the back rooms of taverns, or above seemingly legitimate storefronts. Numbers games flourished in working-class neighborhoods, where residents placed small bets in hopes of a life-changing payout. Loan sharks filled the gap left by banks that refused credit to people in poorer or minority communities. For the organization's leadership, these operations were carefully calibrated, small enough individually to avoid drawing too much attention, but numerous enough to generate a steady river of cash. For those like Lombardo who worked closer to the street, the job was to keep that river flowing, to collect debts firmly but without chaos, to ensure that gambling games ran smoothly, and to handle problems before they attracted police or media scrutiny. Lombardo's ascent within this world appears to have been gradual rather than spectacular. There is no single date at which he transformed from ordinary neighborhood tough into recognized outfit figure. Instead, hints accumulate across disparate sources. FBI documents from later decades retrospectively describe him as having long been associated with the outfit's West Side crew. Chicago police officers who appeared as witnesses in subsequent trials spoke of knowing his name for years before he became widely notorious. Such testimony suggests a man who, in the 1950s, was building a reputation internally, someone trusted to carry messages, to oversee games, to represent higher-ups in meetings with businessmen or union officials. In a culture that prized discretion, this kind of internal recognition mattered more than public notoriety. The Chicago political environment in which he operated made such a career simultaneously easier to pursue and harder to prosecute. The city's democratic machine, under mayors like Richard J. Daley, controlled patronage jobs, zoning decisions, and police promotions. Ward bosses relied on neighborhood captains who could deliver votes and keep order. In some wards, the boundary between political fixer and outfit intermediary was thin. City officials, labor leaders, and outfit representatives often moved in overlapping social circles, dinners at well-known restaurants, charity events, quiet meetings in private rooms. While it would be an overstatement to say that the machine and the outfit were formal partners, there was a tacit understanding in many quarters. As long as public violence was minimized and civic projects moved forward, much of the under-the-table activity would be tolerated. This atmosphere gave men like Lombardo room to operate, provided they understood unwritten limits. A crucial arena where those limits were tested was organized labor, particularly the Teamsters Union. In the post-war years, control over trucking routes, freight terminals, and warehouse staffing translated directly into economic power. The Teamsters' pension and benefit funds accumulated millions of dollars, much of it from dues paid by rank-and-file workers who expected those funds to be managed prudently for their future. For outfit strategists, these funds represented an unprecedented opportunity. Through alliances with cooperative union officials, they could direct loans to businesses in which they had hidden stakes, secure contracts for favored construction firms, or pressure reluctant company owners to accept unionization on terms advantageous to the mob. Lombardo's later federal convictions would establish his involvement in schemes touching union money. But even in the 1950s, investigators believed that he and others on the West Side were helping to build the networks that made such schemes possible. In this period, Lombardo's personal demeanor began to emerge as a distinctive feature in law enforcement and media descriptions. While many mob figures cultivated an air of icy detachment, Lombardo displayed what observers repeatedly called a rough charm. When questioned by officers during routine stops, he would crack jokes. When brought in on suspicion of various offenses, he sometimes smiled for mugshots. Decades later, when he had acquired the nickname Joey the Clown, he would become famous for antics such as holding a newspaper over his face with eye holes cut out to avoid being photographed leaving court. The roots of that public persona lay in these earlier encounters, where he seemed to treat the friction between himself and the authorities as a kind of performance. It was a risky strategy. Humor could humanize him to some, but it also made him memorable. For detectives building long-term files on outfit members, a suspect who stood out was easier to track. As the 1960s began, external pressures on organized crime were intensifying. The sensational Appalachian meeting of 1957, where dozens of mob figures from across the country were detained at a gathering in upstate New York, had forced federal authorities and the public to acknowledge the national scope of what was increasingly called La Cosa Nostra. In Washington, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy took a personal interest in pursuing the mafia, targeting figures from New York's five families to Chicago's outfit. New tools, such as expanded wiretap authority and interstate conspiracy statutes, gave investigators more leverage. In Chicago, this translated into increased surveillance of suspected mob hangouts, closer scrutiny of union finances, and more aggressive use of grand juries. Lombardo, by now an established West Side figure, found himself operating in a climate that was gradually becoming less tolerant of the quiet arrangements that had long protected outfit activity. Within the outfit, leadership was also shifting. Sam Giancana, who rose to prominence as de facto boss in the late 1950s and early 1960s, brought a more flamboyant style than some of his predecessors. His widely reported relationships with entertainers and his rumored involvement in national political intrigues made headlines and, in the eyes of many historians, brought unwelcome attention to an organization that had previously valued invisibility. Yet beneath that spectacle, the core businesses in Chicago continued: gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering. In this environment, mid-level figures like Lombardo were especially important. They were close enough to the street to manage day-to-day operations, but far enough removed from the highest leadership that they could act as buffers. If investigators managed to penetrate a particular scheme, these middlemen were often the ones first exposed to risk. Evidence of Lombardo's rising status within the outfit comes into sharper focus in law enforcement documents from the mid-1960s. FBI charts drawn up during this period, designed to map the structure of the Chicago mob, frequently list his name among the members or significant associates of what came to be known as the Grand Avenue Crew. This designation, drawn from the major thoroughfare running through his old neighborhood, signified a specific constellation of rackets and responsibilities. The Grand Avenue Crew was linked to illegal card games and dice games, to the collection of street tax from independent bookmakers, and to influence within certain Teamsters locals and construction firms. Informants, speaking under conditions of strict secrecy, identified Lombardo as a man who could approve or deny proposals for new gambling operations in the area, signal whether a business owner would be left alone or pressured, and relay instructions from higher-ranking bosses when delicate labor matters were at stake. Yet despite this growing footprint, Lombardo managed for many years to avoid the kind of criminal conviction that would send him to prison for an extended period. This was not because he was absent from illegal activity. Rather, it reflected a combination of organizational discipline and systemic weakness. Witnesses feared retaliation if they testified against outfit figures. Some potential jurors were reluctant to serve in cases involving the mob. There were occasional allegations that judges or prosecutors had been quietly approached or influenced, although proving such claims was often difficult. Federal officials grew increasingly frustrated as cases they had spent months building fell apart in court. In this environment, Lombardo honed a pattern he would follow for most of his life: deny everything, answer questions as little as possible, and never cooperate with investigations into others. That silence in the code of the outfit was both a survival strategy and a demonstration of loyalty. The consequences of the world in which he thrived were felt far beyond the men who attended clandestine meetings or took cash from illegal games. Workers whose pension money was diverted into risky ventures paid the price when their retirements were less secure than promised. Small business owners coerced into paying protection. Fees saw their profits shrink and their independence compromised. Honest union members found their locals, decisions shaped by interests they had never voted for. Even those who never directly encountered the outfit's representatives lived in a city where certain contracts were awarded not on merit, but through hidden influence, distorting markets and undermining trust in public institutions. Lombardo's rise cannot be separated from these broader harms. He operated within a system that normalized the exploitation of vulnerability, financial, social, and sometimes physical, in the pursuit of profit and control. By the end of the 1960s, Joseph Lombardo had moved a long way from the boy wandering the streets of the near West Side, watching older men conduct quiet business in tavern corners. He was now one of those men, an established presence in the outfit's West Side operations, identified by law enforcement as a key member of the Grand Avenue crew, and trusted by superiors who relied on his discretion and his ability to manage complicated, sometimes volatile arrangements. His public profile remained relatively low outside of law enforcement circles. He was not yet the subject of banner headlines or dramatic trials, but the foundations of his later notoriety had been firmly laid. The networks he helped sustain in this period, linking neighborhood gambling to union headquarters, local businesses to distant investment schemes, would, in the 1970s and beyond, become central to some of the most consequential criminal cases in Chicago's modern history, and to the events that would ultimately define his reputation in the eyes of the law and the public. As the 1970s opened, Chicago was a city marked by tension and transformation. The convulsions of the late 1960s, the Democratic National Convention, anti-war protests, racial unrest, had shaken public faith in institutions, but the everyday machinery of power continued turning beneath the headlines. New expressways bisected old neighborhoods, public housing towers rose and then quickly deteriorated, and industries that had once guaranteed a lifetime of employment began to show signs of strain. In this unsettled landscape, the Chicago outfit maintained a quiet continuity. Whatever else changed, bets still had to be collected, debts enforced, and labor disputes managed. Joseph Lombardo, by now firmly embedded in the outfit's West Side operations, moved into this new decade as a man whose reputation inside the organization was steadily growing, even if the general public still barely knew his name. Within law enforcement circles, however, that name was no longer obscure. FBI field reports and Chicago police intelligence summaries from the early 1970s increasingly placed Lombardo in the inner orbit of the outfit's Grand Avenue crew. Informants described him not just as a participant, but as a decision-maker, someone who could authorize new gambling games, approve or veto shakedowns of particular businesses, and speak on behalf of more senior bosses in disputes involving union officials or businessmen. This did not mean that he sat at the very top of the outfit hierarchy. Figures like Tony Accardo and later Joseph Ayapa still held the ultimate authority. But in the West Side territories that had shaped his life, Lombardo was becoming the visible face of that authority, the man whose word could settle arguments in a tavern office or determine whether a small contractor got a lucrative job. The broader underworld around him was also evolving, with traditional vice operations, illegal card games, numbers running, sports betting, firmly entrenched. Outfit strategists had spent the 1950s and 1960s pushing deeper into labor and finance. The Teamsters, Central States Pension Fund in particular, had grown into a financial juggernaut, holding hundreds of millions of dollars in assets contributed by truck drivers, warehouse workers, and other union members across the Midwest and South. In theory, those funds existed to provide secure retirements and benefits. In practice, they offered an enormous pool of capital that could be steered into construction projects, real estate deals, and loans to businesses handpicked by those who controlled the union's upper ranks. Alan Dorfman, a Chicago-based insurance executive and close advisor to Teamsters leadership, became a key intermediary between the pension fund and the outfit. Through Dorfman, loans could be directed to ventures favored by mob families in Chicago, Kansas City, Cleveland, and elsewhere. Some of these ventures were legitimate on their face: hotels, casinos, real estate developments. But behind the scenes, they often served as vehicles for skimming profits, laundering money, or establishing hidden ownership. In this lattice of influence, Lombardo's role was not that of a distant financier, but of a ground-level operative who helped translate high-level decisions into reality, identifying cooperative businessmen, making sure payments flowed as expected, and addressing complications when they arose. At the same time, the legal environment was growing more hostile to organized crime. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, created specifically to tackle the patterns of behavior that characterized groups like the Outfit. RICO allowed prosecutors to treat a series of connected offenses, extortion, fraud, bribery, and more, as part of a larger enterprise, rather than as isolated crimes. Combined with expanded wiretap powers from the 1968 Omnibus Crime Control Act, this gave federal investigators tools they had previously lacked. FBI agents in Chicago began to plant microphones in suspected mob hangouts and tap phones of individuals believed to be key intermediaries. They sifted through union records, subpoenaed bank documents, and leaned on lower-level figures to become informants. In response, the outfit tightened its internal discipline. High-ranking members avoided direct contact with sensitive operations when possible, and instructions were relayed through trusted intermediaries. Lombardo's position in this chain became more crucial. Informants would later describe him as a conduit between neighborhood-level gambling and the upper echelons who determined where money ultimately flowed. He learned to speak obliquely on telephones, to avoid certain subjects and locations that might be bugged, and to use layers of intermediaries when passing sensitive information. Yet he also maintained the persona that had begun to distinguish him from some of his more taciturn colleagues. Officers who interacted with him during stops or brief detentions continued to note his tendency to crack jokes, to greet familiar detectives by name, and to treat even serious legal trouble with an air of wry detachment. That tendency began slowly to filter into public consciousness. When Lombardo's name appeared in local newspapers, most often in short articles about raids on suspected gambling locations or the arrest of known associates of the outfit, it was sometimes accompanied by mention of his irreverent demeanor. He was not yet the widely recognized Joey the Clown of later headlines, but the seed of that image had been planted, a mob figure who seemed to find the theater of crime and punishment darkly amusing. This appearance of levity should not obscure the seriousness of his activities. Behind the jokes lay a steady accumulation of power and trust within an organization that did not hand out such trust lightly. By the early 1970s, that trust extended into ventures touching directly on union finances and the Teamsters Pension Fund. Federal investigations and later trial records reveal that Lombardo's circle intersected with businessmen who, on the surface, ran legitimate operations, but who also served as fronts or conduits in more complex financial schemes. One of these businessmen was Daniel Safer, a young owner of a plastics company in the suburban community of Bensonville, west of Chicago. Safer's firm, though modest in scale, became entangled in an arrangement that drew the attention of federal authorities examining how Teamsters' money was being invested, and whether certain loans or contracts were merely vehicles for siphoning cash. In 1974, after a lengthy investigation, a federal grand jury returned an indictment nomming Lombardo, Safer, and several others. The charges alleged a conspiracy involving fraud against the Teamsters Pension Fund and related offenses. In plain terms, prosecutors believed that Safer's business had been used as part of a scheme to misuse union money, and that Lombardo, as an important outfit figure, had orchestrated or overseen key elements of that arrangement. For the government, This case promised not merely to punish individual wrongdoing, but to illuminate the methods by which organized crime exploited Union resources. Safer, facing serious charges, agreed to cooperate with authorities and was expected to testify at trial. This decision placed Safer in a precarious position, both legally and personally. Federal court records and later testimony make clear that he had been close enough to Lombardo and his associates to serve as more than a casual business contact. Now, as a potential government witness, he represented a direct threat to a man who had built his reputation within the outfit on discretion and loyalty. For prosecutors, securing his cooperation was a breakthrough. For Lombardo and those around him, it was a development fraught with danger. Yet in the summer of 1974, as pretrial proceedings moved forward, there was still cautious confidence within the U.S. Attorney's Office that the case, with Seifert as a central witness, would mark a significant step in holding an influential Chicago mob figure accountable. On the morning of September 27, 1974, that expectation was violently overturned. At Seifert's plastics factory in Bensonville, armed men entered the premises. In a matter of moments, Seifert was shot and killed. In view of his workplace and, tragically, members of his family, the attack was swift and ruthless, leaving little doubt among experienced investigators about its purpose. While the specific details of the crime would be examined repeatedly over the decades that followed, the broad outline was unmistakable. A key federal witness in a case involving the Chicago outfit had been silenced before he could take the stand. The killing sent shockwaves through law enforcement circles. Agents and prosecutors who had spent months building the pension fraud case gathered in haste to assess what remained of their evidence. Without Seifert's testimony, the heart of their narrative, that a seemingly legitimate business had been used as part of an outfit-directed scheme, was severely compromised. Other documentary evidence existed, but it had been his anticipated first-hand account that tied the threads together in a way a jury could easily understand. Now, that thread had been cut. While some charges went forward and proceedings continued, the case against Lombardo ultimately unraveled. In 1975, he was acquitted on the major counts stemming from the Seifert-connected indictment. Officially, at that point, there was no legal finding that tied Lombardo to Seifert's death. No charges were filed against him in relation to the murder during the 1970s. Yet within the closed world of outfit politics and the equally tight-knit community of organized crime investigators, the implications were widely understood. A man willing to testify against Lombardo in a significant financial case had been killed, and Lombardo had walked out of federal court vindicated. Among his peers in the outfit, this could only enhance his standing. He had emerged intact from a dangerous legal challenge. Among law enforcement officials, the episode hardened their view of him as both influential and unyielding, a man who, in their assessment, would go to great lengths to protect himself and his organization. For the wider public, however, the story barely registered beyond a few newspaper articles. Seifert's murder was reported as another suspected mob hit in a city long accustomed to such headlines. The complexities of pension fund schemes and union loans did not capture attention the way the more colorful tales of Las Vegas casinos or high-profile gangland feuds did. Lombardo's acquittal in the associated federal case was similarly not a media sensation. In a decade filled with political scandals, economic crises, and national turmoil, the quiet collapse of a Chicago pension fraud trial seemed, to many, a local matter. Inside the U.S. Department of Justice, though, the case became a rallying point. It underscored the vulnerability of witnesses who agreed to testify against organized crime figures, and it reinforced the need for stronger witness protection measures and more robust conspiracy laws. Over the next several years, federal programs to relocate and protect cooperating witnesses would expand. Prosecutors would become more cautious about relying too heavily on a single individual's testimony in complex cases. And in Chicago, FBI agents renewed their efforts to penetrate the outfit's inner workings, seeking informants who could provide not just isolated tips, but a sustained, comprehensive picture of how decisions were made and enforced. Lombardo, for his part, continued to operate with apparent confidence. The narrow escape from serious conviction in the wake of Seyfert's death seemed to sharpen his instincts rather than blunt them. Those who dealt with him in the years immediately after the 1974 acquittal described a man who combined affability with a clear sense of boundaries. He might joke with a bartender or a neighborhood acquaintance, but when business was at hand, his tone could become curt. He remained careful about what he discussed in public places, and he made use of intermediaries when particularly sensitive matters were involved. At the same time, he maintained a semblance of ordinary domestic life, family, home, routine, that stood in stark contrast to the allegations swirling in confidential law enforcement files. In retrospect, historians and investigators alike see this mid-1970s period as a turning point in Lombardo's trajectory. Up to that point, he had been an important, regionally focused mob figure, a man whose authority carried weight on the West Side but whose name was unfamiliar to most Chicagoans. After the Seifert-related case, his profile among federal agents rose significantly. He was no longer just another crew leader, but, in their eyes, a central player in the outfit's efforts to exploit union resources and to obstruct justice when threatened. His ability to avoid conviction despite intense scrutiny also suggested to them that he was deeply insulated, that he enjoyed the protection, explicit or implicit, of higher-ranking bosses who considered him indispensable. Meanwhile, the economic terrain that had long sustained the outfit was shifting. Increased competition in the gambling world, both legal and illegal, meant that neighborhood operations had to work harder to yield the same returns. The proliferation of state lotteries and off-track betting eroded some of the organization's traditional revenue streams. At the same time, opportunities were expanding in other arenas, particularly in the casino industries of Nevada and beyond. Access to capital through union pension funds remained a powerful lever. In this changing economy of vice and influence, the skills of someone like Lombardo, grounded in neighborhood muscle but increasingly comfortable with paperwork, loans, and front companies, were especially valuable. Decades later, during the family secrets trial, a cooperating witness from within the outfit would testify that Lombardo had personally participated in Seyfert's murder, describing in careful, non-sensational terms a crime whose basic outline had been suspected for years. That testimony would finally connect the dots between the 1974 killing and Lombardo's legal fortunes in its aftermath. But in the 1970s themselves, that link remained unproven in court. What was beyond dispute even then was that Joseph Lombardo emerged from that decade as a tougher, more central figure in Chicago's underworld. A man who had survived a serious federal challenge, maintained his freedom, and solidified his status in an organization that was now increasingly entangled not only in neighborhood rackets, but in national financial schemes and interstate casino ventures. The stage was set for a new round of confrontations, this time on a larger and more public scale, that would finally bring him the national attention he had so long managed to evade. The final years of the 1970s were a study in contrasts for Chicago. On the surface, the city was modernizing. Glass towers rose over the Loop, neighborhood factories converted to industrial parks, and O'Hare Airport cemented its status as a hub of national travel. Yet beneath that new skyline, older systems of power persisted. Political patronage still shaped who got hired, which contracts were awarded, and how strictly certain laws were enforced. In the shadows of this machinery, the Chicago outfit remained what it had quietly become after the Prohibition era, a diversified criminal enterprise whose reach extended well beyond the city limits. Joseph Lombardo entered this period as one of the outfit's most trusted West Side figures, a man whose influence, though rarely acknowledged in public, was recognized in FBI files and whispered about in taverns and social clubs from Grand Avenue to the suburbs. The outfit's ambitions had long since outgrown neighborhood gambling and local protection rackets. Since the 1950s, Chicago bosses had been pushing into Las Vegas, sensing that the casino industry offered a legal facade for the same sort of profits once generated by bootleg liquor. With the help of Teamsters pension fund loans, hotels and casinos had been built or refinanced under the guidance of mob-connected managers. The mechanism of profit was simple and effective. Money was taken off the top of casino earnings before those earnings were officially recorded. This practice, known as skimming, allowed the outfit and its partners in other Midwestern cities to collect substantial cash without paying taxes or disclosing their involvement. Men like Anthony Spilatro, a Chicago enforcer dispatched to Las Vegas, handled the rougher side of this operation, intimidating potential troublemakers, keeping employees in line, and ensuring that the skimmed money continued to flow. Lombardo was not a casino floor boss or a figure seen mingling with gamblers under neon lights. His role, as understood by investigators piecing together the hierarchy, was more strategic and more obscure. From Chicago, he represented the interests of the outfit's West Side faction in ventures that depended on Teamsters loans and hidden partnerships. His long-standing association with insurance executive and Teamsters advisor Alan Dorfman placed him close to the intersection of union finance and organized crime. Dorfman occupied a crucial position, translating the wishes of mob-linked bosses into loans and investments approved by the Teamsters, Central States Pension Fund. Lombardo, with his roots in neighborhood rackets and his growing understanding of financial schemes, operated in the space between street-level enforcement and high-level planning, making sure that theoretical deals translated into real money and that businessmen who benefited from union-backed investments remembered who had made those deals possible. The Central States Pension Fund remained at the heart of this system. Every pay period, truck drivers and warehouse workers had money deducted from their wages, building what they believed would be a secure cushion for retirement. By the late 1970s, that fund controlled hundreds of millions of dollars and its loan portfolio. Sprawled across the country, for most rank-and-file Teamsters, the names of borrowers and the terms of those loans were abstractions buried deep in financial reports. For the outfit, they were lines in a ledger that could translate into influence over hotels, construction projects, and casinos. Federal agents, increasingly alarmed by the scale of possible abuse, began to focus not only on individual bad loans, but on the patterns suggesting that entire categories of investment had been steered toward ventures quietly controlled or exploited by organized crime. Las Vegas, with its stream of tourist dollars and its loosely regulated corporate structures, offered a particularly attractive target. Throughout the 1970s, FBI field offices in Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Las Vegas shared intelligence about Midwestern criminals who appeared to be working together. Bugs placed in Kansas City social clubs captured conversations in which local bosses talked openly about our interests in specific casinos and about the need to keep regulatory agencies at bay. From those tapes, a picture emerged of a multi-city consortium of mob families that included Chicago, using front men and straw owners to control parts of the Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and other casinos. While Lombardo's voice did not feature prominently on the Kansas City recording that would later fuel the famous Strawman prosecutions, Chicago agents believed that the West Side crew he helped lead was deeply embedded in the broader network sustaining those skimming operations. Back in Chicago, Lombardo's day-to-day focus still included the nuts and bolts of running a powerful neighborhood organization. The Grand Avenue crew oversaw illegal card games, sports betting operations, and loan sharking throughout the city's west side and parts of the western suburbs. Informants described carefully managed card nights in back rooms where local businessmen, union officials, and occasional politicians played for high stakes. Bookmakers took bets on baseball, football, and basketball games, paying a portion of their profits upward as street tax in exchange for protection. Loan collectors enforced repayment schedules for high-interest loans extended to those who could not or would not seek credit from banks. In this environment, Lombardo's combination of easy banter and firm authority proved useful. To clients and subordinates, he could appear approachable, even likable. To those who challenged his decisions or threatened outfit interests, he could be unyielding. The precariousness of life inside the outfit was starkly illustrated in 1978. That year, burglars broke into the suburban home of Tony Accardo, the longtime Chicago boss who, even when he held no official title, was widely regarded as the ultimate authority in the organization. The break-in was a bold and reckless act. Robbing an ordinary wealthy resident of Chicago's suburbs was one thing. Robbing the man considered the city's most powerful mob figure was quite another. Over the months that followed, several of the suspected burglars were found killed, one after another, in separate attacks marked not by public spectacle but by clinical finality. Law enforcement officials believed these acts were a coordinated response, a message that certain lines could not be crossed without severe consequence. Lombardo's name surfaced in some investigative reports as someone present at meetings where the outfit's reaction was discussed, reflecting his proximity to the inner circle, but he was not charged in connection with the string of killings. The episode nonetheless underscored the environment in which he operated. Loyalty upward was expected, and internal discipline, when necessary, could be harsh. While the outfit enforced its own rules on the street, the federal government was trying to enforce the law in boardrooms and back offices. One of the most significant fronts in this effort emerged from a seemingly arcane corner of legislative politics: the deregulation of the trucking industry. In the late 1970s, proposals in Washington aimed to open the industry to more competition, reducing the power of established firms and, in turn, potentially weakening the influence of the Teamsters Union. For certain business interests and their mob backers, these reforms threatened profits and control. Federal investigators would later allege that a group of union officials, businessmen, and organized crime figures, including Alan Dorfman and Joseph Lombardo, devised a plan to influence the position of a key lawmaker, U.S. Senator Howard Cannon of Nevada, who sat on a committee vital to trucking legislation. According to the government's case, the scheme involved more than routine lobbying or campaign contributions. In the early 1980s, a series of FBI wiretaps and undercover operations began documenting discussions among Teamsters President Roy Williams, Dorfman, Lombardo, and others about providing value to Cannon in exchange for favorable action, or inaction, on deregulation measures. The benefits allegedly contemplated ranged from campaign support to business favors in Las Vegas. To connect all the dots, agents went beyond simple eavesdropping. They cultivated informants within the Teamsters hierarchy and among peripheral associates of the outfit. Piece by piece, they assembled a narrative in which Lombardo appeared not only as a local enforcer, but as an active participant in a national-level conspiracy that blended labor politics, union finance, and organized crime. The Justice Department brought this investigation under the umbrella of what it called Operation Pendor, a code name derived from pension and Dorfman. At its core was the contention that those charged had conspired to misuse the Central States Pension Fund and to corrupt a sitting United States senator in order to protect their financial and organizational interests. In 1981, a federal grand jury returned an indictment nomming Lombardo, Dorfman, Williams, and several others. The charges included conspiring to bribe a public official and to defraud the pension fund by steering loans and investments toward projects aligned with outfit objectives. For the first time, Lombardo faced a case that drew national attention before it ever reached trial, not because of his own notoriety, but because it touched on the broader themes of union corruption and legislative integrity. When Lombardo appeared in court in connection with the Pendorf case, reporters who had covered organized crime for years saw someone both familiar and unusual. He was not imposing in stature. He wore ordinary suits, sometimes a bit rumpled, and he greeted photographers with a half-smile that suggested, if not amusement, then at least a conscious refusal to be cowed by the public spotlight. On one occasion leaving court, he raised a newspaper in front of his face with holes cut out for his eyes, turning the act of avoiding a photograph into a visual joke that ran in papers across Chicago. It was during this era that the nickname Joey the Clown, which had circulated informally among police and reporters, began to show up in print with regularity. The moniker reflected his penchant for antics, but it also risked trivializing the serious allegations against him. Allegations that, if proven, would place him at the center of an attempt to bend federal policy and misuse working people's retirement money for criminal ends. Inside the courtroom, there was little that resembled comedy. Prosecutors methodically introduced wiretap transcripts, surveillance photographs, and testimony from insiders who described the relationships between Teamsters leaders, businessmen, and outfit figures. Jurors heard conversations in which officials spoke in guarded but understandable terms about using pension money as a tool of influence. They heard references to meetings in Las Vegas, to assurances that friends back home would be taken care of, and to the need to ensure that trucking deregulation did not advance. Lombardo's name appeared in these materials as part of the circle of men discussing and facilitating such plans. The defense responded by attacking the credibility of cooperating witnesses, arguing that prosecutors were stretching ambiguous language into sinister plots, and insisting that routine political advocacy and union negotiation had been mischaracterized as bribery. Throughout the proceedings, Lombardo maintained his characteristic posture, polite to the judge, occasionally chatty with marshals or court staff, but firmly insistent on his innocence. Reporters covering the trial noted that he appeared attentive during testimony, sometimes leaning over to whisper to his attorneys, other times simply watching with an expression that was hard to read, neither panicked nor detached. He continued his practice of refusing to acknowledge any formal connection to the Chicago outfit, presenting himself instead as a businessman and family man, falsely swept into an overbroad conspiracy case. In the early 1980s, after weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Lombardo, along with Alan Dorfman and Roy Williams, was found guilty on key counts. For the government, the convictions were a landmark. They had secured judgments not merely against shadowy street enforcers, but against the president of a major labor union, an influential financial advisor, and a reputed mob figure in a single case that linked union corruption to attempted political bribery. At sentencing, the judge emphasized the breach of trust inherent in the misuse of pension funds and the attempt to compromise a senator's duties. Lombardo received a substantial prison term, 15 years, reflecting both the gravity of the offense and his perceived role within the broader enterprise. The impact of the Pendorf case rippled outward. Within the Teamsters, it accelerated federal efforts to monitor and reform the union's governance. In Congress and the press, it fueled debates about how law and politics could be shielded from covert influence by organized crime. For Chicago's working-class families, many of whom had long suspected that somebody up there was mishandling their retirement money, the revelations confirmed their worst fears. The pensions they had counted on were not simply at the mercy of market forces. They had been treated as a private bank by men more concerned with personal and organizational power than with the livelihoods of ordinary members. For Lombardo personally, the conviction marked a profound shift. For the first time, He would spend an extended period in federal custody, removed from the neighborhoods and networks that had defined his adult life. Prison offered no room for the theatrical gestures that had made him a favorite subject of courthouse photographers, but those who encountered him behind bars later remembered that he retained much of his outward demeanor. He spent time in the prison law library, studying case books and filing motions on his own behalf. He offered informal advice to other inmates facing legal trouble, explaining procedures, suggesting arguments, and occasionally drafting documents. This self-taught engagement with the legal system was not unique among long-term prisoners, but in Lombardo's case, it reinforced his image as someone who, even when constrained, sought ways to assert agency and maintain a sense of control. Outside the prison walls, the outfit adapted to his absence. Leadership positions shifted as older bosses died, retired, or were themselves imprisoned. The Las Vegas skimming cases that had grown from the Kansas City wiretaps culminated in the mid-1980s with high-profile trials in which several senior figures from Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland were convicted. The convictions weakened the direct control Midwestern mobs held over certain casinos, but they did not erase the influence the outfit retained in construction, gambling, and labor racketeering at home. In FBI organizational charts from this period, Lombardo's name was often bracketed with the notation, incarcerated, a reminder that his physical absence did not erase his significance. Agents and prosecutors believed that, through carefully screened visitors and coded correspondence, he continued to maintain contact with trusted associates, though the extent and effect of those contacts remained a matter of debate. The safer case, too, lingered in the background. Even as the statute of limitations on certain financial charges expired, the unsolved 1974 murder remained an open wound for investigators who had lost a key witness and watched a major case collapse as a result. New information occasionally trickled in from informants or from debriefings of other mob figures who chose to cooperate in unrelated matters. Lombardo's name appeared again and again in those confidential reports, usually alongside qualifying phrases, believed to have, allegedly involved in, said by informant X to be responsible for. None of it was yet solid enough to support a new indictment, but the pattern deepened the suspicion that the man now serving time for pension fund and bribery offenses had been involved in more deadly acts of obstruction years earlier. As the 1980s gave way to the early 1990s, Lombardo approached the possibility of release. Good time credits and the structure of his sentence meant that he would not serve the full 15 years handed down by the judge. For law enforcement, his eventual return to Chicago posed a pressing question. Would he attempt to reclaim an active role in the outfit's operations, or would age, prison, and the changing landscape of organized crime push him toward a quieter existence? They knew that even a semi-retired mob figure could wield considerable influence simply by virtue of reputation. Among those who had grown up hearing of Joey the Clown as a man who beat major cases and took the fall in others without ever cooperating, his word, delivered in person, by phone, or through intermediaries, could shape important decisions. In this period, federal authorities did not simply wait for his release. They continued to cultivate sources inside the outfit, gradually assembling the body of evidence that would, more than a decade later, form the backbone of the family secrets investigation. Cooperating witnesses began to speak openly, behind closed doors, about murders that had gone unsolved for 30 years, about the internal rules governing hits, and about the roles played by various crews and captains. Lombardo's name surfaced repeatedly in relation to the Grand Avenue crew and to pivotal acts of violence and intimidation dating back to the 1960s and 1970s. Although these revelations would not be presented in open court until the 2000s, they ensured that when Lombardo eventually walked out of prison, he would step into a world where his past was far from forgotten, and where a new generation of investigators was determined to hold him to account not only for financial crimes, but for the bloodier chapters of his history that had long remained officially unacknowledged. On a cold day in the early 1990s, the gates of a federal prison swung open and Joseph Lombardo stepped back into free air. He was in his early 60s now, a far cry from the young man who had once run errands on Chicago's West Side. Years in custody had thinned his hair and deepened the lines on his face, but observers noticed that his gait was steady and his demeanor unchanged. He joked with guards on his way out, carried himself with an almost casual air, and gave no sign that the weight of a 15-year sentence, cut down by time-served credits, had broken his confidence. To the Bureau of Prisons, he was another inmate completing a term. To federal agents in Chicago, he was a figure they had spent decades chasing, now returning to a city that had changed in many ways but still bore the imprint of the outfit whose interests he had served. Chicago in the early 1990s was no longer the industrial powerhouse of Lombardo's youth. Steel mills on the southeast side had closed or downsized. Some of the factories that once lined the west side had become vacant lots or warehouses for smaller firms. New glass towers and renovated shopping districts tried to project a fresh image, but unemployment and disinvestment were real problems in many neighborhoods. The old ethnic enclaves had shifted. Italian families who could afford it had moved further west or into the suburbs, while new waves of immigrants and African American residents filled the spaces they left behind. The city's political machine, though still formidable, had been weakened by reform movements and corruption scandals. Yet despite these changes, the outfit had not disappeared. It had adapted, leaner, more cautious, but still embedded in the spaces where illicit profit could be made. The outfit Lombardo was returning to had absorbed heavy blows in the preceding decade. The Las Vegas skimming cases had sent leading bosses from Chicago, Kansas City, and other Midwestern cities to prison. Longtime power broker Tony Accardo, though still revered, was aging and increasingly withdrawn from day-to-day affairs. Operational control had passed to others, including figures like Sam Wings Carlisi and later, John No-Nose Di Franz. These men steered the organization away from the high-profile casino ventures that had drawn intense federal scrutiny and back toward more local, if no less harmful, rackets, video poker machines in taverns, sports betting, construction fraud, union manipulation, and traditional loan sharking. In FBI organizational charts of the period, Lombardo's name remained near the top, usually associated with the Grand Avenue crew, and sometimes annotated with terms like advisor or consigliere, reflecting the belief that, even if he did not hold a formal title, his opinion still carried tremendous weight. One of the conditions of his release was supervision by federal probation officers. Standard rules applied. He was not to associate with convicted felons. He was to report contacts with law enforcement, and any substantial changes in his finances or residence were to be disclosed. For an ordinary ex-offender, these rules might have been manageable, even mundane. For a man whom agents regarded as a central node in a criminal organization, they posed a serious challenge. Almost everyone Lombardo was rumored to deal with, crew leaders, bookmakers, union fixers, had some sort of record. To comply strictly with the law would have meant cutting himself off from the very networks that defined his adult life. What Lombardo did instead was try to redefine his public image. Within months of his release, he caused a statement to appear in a Chicago newspaper, an open letter addressed to a federal judge and the people of the city. In it, he insisted that he had retired from any involvement in wrongdoing, denied ever having been a member or associate of what the press called the Chicago outfit, and expressed a desire to live quietly as a family man and senior citizen. He added that he had paid his debt to society for the Pendorf case and wished to be left alone. He signed off politely, even wryly, emphasizing his age as if to suggest that whatever he might once have been, he was now merely an old man hopping to enjoy his remaining years in peace. To casual readers, the letter may have sounded like a blend of denial and weary resignation. To law enforcement officials who had tracked Lombardo for decades, it read as something else entirely. A carefully crafted message designed to create doubt, muddy his public profile, and perhaps sow confusion about his continuing status inside the outfit. They pointed out that his disavowals contrasted sharply with years of surveillance reports, informant statements, and wiretap notations that placed him at the center of key operations. The letter did not convince them to stop watching. If anything, it redoubled their determination to document what he did after prison, whom he met, which businesses he frequented, and how often his paths crossed with other men they considered part of Chicago's criminal hierarchy. On the streets of the West Side and in nearby suburbs, people noticed his return. Lombardo was not flamboyant in his habits. He did not drive luxury cars or dine ostentatiously at the city's trendiest restaurants. Instead, he appeared in familiar haunts, modest Italian eateries, neighborhood social clubs, quiet offices above storefronts. He was sometimes seen riding a bicycle around his neighborhood, an almost disarming image of ordinariness. Detectives assigned to organized crime units would spot him at gatherings with other known figures and dutifully record the encounters in their reports. Subject Lombardo, observed in conversation with name redacted, convicted felon. Probation officers warned him that such meetings could violate his release conditions. Lombardo responded, through his attorneys, that Chicago was a big city and that he could not be held responsible if, from time to time, he crossed paths with people whose records he had not checked. Meanwhile, the outfit's business model in the 1990s increasingly turned on ventures that, at a glance, looked legal. Video poker machines appeared in barrooms and social clubs across the metropolitan area. In some places, they were permitted for amusement only, with no cash payouts allowed. In others, the rules were looser. Behind the scenes, outfit-linked distributors provided the machines, collected a share of the cash, and arranged with bar owners to pay out winnings quietly in cash or drinks. Construction companies with hidden mob ties received contracts for road projects, water lines, and municipal buildings, sometimes through collusion in the bidding process, sometimes through subtle pressure on elected officials or union leaders. Sports betting remained a staple, but much of it moved off the streets and onto telephone lines, later onto the internet, complicating enforcement. In all these ventures, the outfit required men who could translate strategy into action, who could meet with a tavern owner reluctant to install gambling machines, who could reassure a small contractor about the benefits of teaming up with certain partners, who could smooth over disputes when an overenthusiastic collector threatened to cause a public scene. Law enforcement sources and later court testimony suggested that Lombardo filled such a role, not necessarily by showing up personally in every sensitive moment, but by setting expectations, delivering approvals, and, when necessary, issuing quiet warnings. His long history, coupled with the lore built around his ability to beat serious charges and maintain silence, lent his words considerable weight. Associates believed that instructions they received directly or indirectly from him reflected the wishes of higher-ups as well. Parallel to these underworld developments, a transformation was unfolding in how Chicago's political and judicial institutions dealt with organized crime and corruption. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a series of federal investigations targeted the First Ward, downtown's political stronghold historically tied to both city government and the outfit. Operations with names like Gambit revealed corrupt relationships between judges, lawyers, and mob-connected fixers. Hidden microphones in judicial chambers and backroom offices captured conversations about rigging cases, fixing tickets, and exchanging cash for favorable rulings. While Lombardo was not a defendant in these specific prosecutions, the revelations confirmed the world he had long inhabited, one in which official authority could be bent behind closed doors, and where justice was, at times, something to be negotiated rather than applied. The exposure of such corruption had a double effect. On one hand, it weakened certain long-standing channels through which outfit figures had previously buffered themselves from law enforcement pressure. A compromised judge removed from the bench could no longer steer cases. A discredited ward committeeman could no longer be relied on to smooth over licensing problems or policing quills. On the other hand, it signaled to seasoned mobsters that the federal government was increasingly willing to use undercover techniques and informants in realms once considered untouchable. Hidden microphones in a judge's chambers made it easier to imagine similar devices in a mob social club, a union office, or the back room of a restaurant. For Lombardo, who had already learned to assume that phones might be tapped and rooms bugged, the message was clear. The margin for error was shrinking. While he maneuvered within these tightening constraints, another process, invisible to him, was beginning that would eventually reshape his life. For years, certain murders associated with the outfit, some dating back to the 1960s and 1970s, had remained officially unsolved. Investigators often had strong suspicions about who was responsible, bolstered by informant whispers and patterns of motive, but lacking cooperative witnesses. They struggled to assemble cases strong enough to withstand defense scrutiny and juror skepticism. The killings had followed a familiar pattern, targeted attacks on individuals perceived as threats, whether because they had stolen from the organization, refused an order, or signaled an intention to assist law enforcement. One of those was the 1974 murder of Daniel Safer, the plastics company owner who had agreed to testify against Lombardo in a union-related fraud case. In 1998, a breakthrough occurred. A member of the outfit's extended circle, Nicholas Calabrese, was charged in a racketeering and loan sharking case involving his brother, Frank Calabrese SR, a powerful figure in the outfit's Chinatown crew. During the investigation, federal agents confronted Nicholas with forensic evidence tying him to a past homicide. A glove recovered from a 1986 killing carried DNA that, by the late 1990s, could be conclusively linked to him, something that had not been possible at the time of the crime. Faced with the likelihood of spending the rest of his life in prison, Nicholas made a decision that, in the code of the outfit, constituted the ultimate betrayal. He agreed to cooperate with the government. Over months and then years, in carefully recorded debriefings, Nicholas Calabrese described dozens of acts of violence committed at the direction of the outfit, including nearly 20 murders. He named participants, recounted planning meetings, and detailed the reasons certain individuals had been targeted. Among the names that surfaced repeatedly in his account was Joseph Lombardo. Calabrese placed Lombardo within the context of the Grand Avenue crew and linked him directly to key decisions and actions, including the murder of Daniel Safer. For investigators who had long suspected such connections, the corroboration from a direct participant was a revelation. It transformed old, largely circumstantial cases into potential pillars of a new, wide-ranging prosecution. The FBI and federal prosecutors treated this information with utmost secrecy. They recognized that if word spread that a member of the outfit had begun talking in such detail, others might flee, destroy evidence, or retaliate. Under the internal code name Family Secrets, agents began to map the web of crimes described by Calabrese, cross-checking his statements against existing files, police reports, forensic records, and older informant tips. They reconstructed timelines, when certain victims had disappeared, where their bodies had been found, what other investigations were active at the time. Patterns emerged. Murders once seen as isolated now appeared connected by shared crews, overlapping motives, and similar methods. Lombardo's name appeared again and again in the notes of those meetings, not as a peripheral character, but as a central figure in one of the outfit's most enduringly powerful factions. While this underground case-building progressed, Lombardo's life on the surface followed a quieter, if tension-filled, track. By the late 1990s, he was deep into his 60s, an age when many men in his old neighborhood were long retired. He continued to insist, in conversations with acquaintances and through statements relayed by his lawyers, that he had left his past behind. When asked by reporters about allegations that he remained an outfit leader, he brushed them off, sometimes with a joke, sometimes with a simple denial. He did not flaunt wealth. His home was modest, his clothing unremarkable. Yet surveillance teams routinely photographed him meeting with reputed mobsters at coffee shops and banquet halls, embracing them as old friends, laughing at shared stories. These sightings occasionally provoked formal responses from the justice system. Supervising judges questioned whether he was abiding by the terms of his supervised release. Hearings were held in which probation officers recounted observing him in the company of convicted felons. Lombardo's defense was consistent. Chicago's Italian-American community was tight-knit, he said, and he could not realistically isolate himself from everyone who had ever brushed up against the law. To do so would mean withdrawing from weddings, funerals, and community events where old acquaintances gathered. Judges, keenly aware of his history, sometimes tightened conditions but rarely jailed him outright for such associations, wary of turning routine social contact into a pretext for reincarceration without clear evidence of ongoing criminal activity. The disconnect between Lombardo's public claims of retirement and law enforcement's private conviction that he remained active highlighted a broader challenge in combating modern organized crime. Unlike the conspicuous gang bosses of the Prohibition era, contemporary leaders learned to blend in. They did not necessarily own mansions in their own names or appear nightly in supper clubs. Instead, their influence flowed through shell companies, silent partnerships, and trusted intermediaries. To outsiders, an elderly man meeting friends at a neighborhood restaurant could look like any retiree reliving old times. To investigators armed with long case files and fresh intelligence, the same scene might represent a strategic consultation about loans, disputes, or enforcement decisions. Meanwhile, the passage of time was reshaping the outfit from within. Men who had come of age in the 1940s and 1950s were dying or entering nursing homes. Younger replacements, often in their 30s and 40s, took on more responsibilities, but the shadow of the older generation continued to loom large. Stories circulated about how certain figures, Lombardo among them, had handled crises decades earlier, surviving major prosecutions and, in the eyes of their peers, proving their loyalty by serving sentences without cooperating. These stories endowed them with a kind of mythic status inside the organization. A nod from such a figure could validate a course of action. A discouraging word could shelve a proposal before it ever took shape. That legacy influence persisted even if, as Lombardo claimed, he had stepped back from direct management of day-to-day operations. Throughout the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, federal agents working on the emerging family secrets case moved deliberately. They knew from experience that prosecutions based on old crimes were vulnerable to attack. Memories faded, records were lost, some witnesses had died. To construct a racketeering case under RICO, they needed not only to prove individual acts, murders, extortions, frauds, but to show that those acts formed part of an ongoing criminal enterprise stretching across decades. In internal memos, they debated which defendants to target and which incidents to include. Lombardo was always on those lists. His involvement spanned the period they were focused on, from the early 1960s through the 1980s. He had already been convicted once for a major outfit-related conspiracy, establishing his connection to the larger enterprise. And his name, whenever raised among informants or in Calabrese's accounts, invariably drew stories that pointed toward the most serious kind of criminal conduct. On the streets, Lombardo could not see these deliberations, but he sensed the renewed attention. Friends later recalled that he became more circumspect, especially when discussing the past. He was known to wave off certain topics with a dismissive gesture, saying there was no point in talking about ancient history. Yet ancient history, as far as the law was concerned, remained very much alive. There is no statute of limitations on murder, and under RICO, past acts of violence could be charged as part of a continuing pattern as long as the conspiracy itself remained active. For a man whose reputation had been forged in an era when witnesses were scarce and cases could be stalled by missing files or reluctant juries, the advent of DNA analysis, long-term cooperating insiders, and digital archiving represented a fundamental change in the terrain. By the early 2000s, whispers about a big case coming began to circulate in both law enforcement and underworld circles. Retired detectives heard from former colleagues that old homicides were being revisited with unusual intensity. Lawyers who had long represented reputed outfit figures noticed an uptick in quiet inquiries from clients wondering what, if anything, they might be exposed to if others started talking. In this atmosphere of unease, Joseph Lombardo, now well into his 70s, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. He walked his neighborhood, visited family, and continued to present himself as a man unjustly associated with a criminal past. But the forces gathering beyond his line of sight, built on the testimonies of men who had once sat beside him at tables where weighty decisions were made, were about to bring that past crashing into the present in a way he could not evade with a letter to the editor or a wry smile outside a courtroom. On an overcast Monday in late April 2005, reporters packed into the Dirksen Federal Building in downtown Chicago. Cameras crowded the back of the room as U.S. Attorney Patrick Fitzgerald stepped to a podium, flanked by FBI agents and Justice Department officials. The press conference had been billed as a major announcement on organized crime. Even in a city accustomed to corruption cases and mob stories, the details that followed were extraordinary. A sweeping indictment, years in the making, charged that the Chicago outfit's leadership had overseen a criminal enterprise involving gambling, extortion, loan sharking, and most explosively, a string of 18 murders carried out between 1960 and 1986. Among the names on the charging documents was a figure well known to investigators but long distant from the front pages. Joseph, Joey the Clown Lombardo, now 76 years old, and accused of helping to direct an organization that had ruled parts of Chicago's underworld for half a century. The indictment was the culmination of the secret effort federal agents had code-named Family Secrets. At its center was the cooperation of Nicholas Calabrese, the outfit hitman who had broken the mob's code of silence after forensic evidence tied him to an old murder. In debriefing after debriefing, Calabrese had described killings carried out at the direction of outfit bosses, linking individual crimes into a coherent narrative of discipline and control. His accounts, painstakingly cross-checked against old police files, autopsy reports, and other informant statements, gave prosecutors the backbone they had long lacked, a participant's testimony that connected the dots from the lowest-level enforcers to the men who gave the orders. Using RICO, they wove these acts into a single racketeering conspiracy stretching across decades. For Lombardo, the indictment reached back to one of the most painful episodes in his history with law enforcement, the 1974 murder of Daniel Seifert. The new charges alleged that the killing had been carried out to prevent Seifert from testifying in the federal pension fraud case that had once threatened to send Lombardo to prison. The government now claimed that Lombardo had not been a passive beneficiary of Seifert's silencing, but an active planner and participant, working with other outfit figures to eliminate a witness. Alongside that murder charge, the indictment accused him of taking part in the broader conspiracy that sustained the outfit's gambling and extortion rackets into the 21st century. There was, however, a dramatic complication. When agents fanned out across the Chicago area to arrest the men named in the Family Secrets indictment, they found most of their targets at home or in familiar locations. Frank Calabrese SR, James Marcello, and other alleged leaders were taken into custody without incident. Joseph Lombardo was not. When marshals arrived at his known addresses, he was nowhere to be found. His car was missing. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him. Within days, the FBI issued a wanted poster featuring an older photograph. Lombardo with slicked back hair, heavy glasses, and a half smile that seemed to mock the idea of capture. Once again, he had managed, at least temporarily, to slip out of the government's grasp. In the months that followed, Lombardo's status as a fugitive became part of the unfolding drama. Television stations occasionally ran segments on the search, showing his image and asking viewers to call in tips. Agents checked with relatives, monitored known associates, and watched places he had been known to frequent. They suspected that, at his age, he was unlikely to flee the region entirely. More probable, they believed, was that he would rely on old friends to provide temporary shelter in apartments, basements, or outbuildings, rotating locations to stay a step ahead of surveillance. The challenge lay in penetrating the circle of loyalty that had surrounded him for decades. Then, in a move that seemed to fit his curious public persona, Lombardo reached out not in person but on paper. In December 2005, as the manhunt entered its 8th month, a handwritten letter postmarked from the Chicago area arrived at the clerk's office of the federal court. It was addressed to Judge James Zagel, who had been assigned to the family secrets case. The writer identified himself as Joseph Lombardo. In neat, somewhat formal handwriting, he denied involvement in any of the murders listed in the indictment, insisted he had never been a member of the outfit, and argued that many of the crimes described had occurred while he was either in prison or under close supervision, making his participation impossible. He asked the court to appoint him an attorney and to grant him a separate trial from his co-defendants, suggesting that he would surrender if certain conditions were met. The letter was as notable for its tone as for its content. It blended legalistic phrasing with the same wry defiance that had marked Lombardo's prior public statements. He portrayed himself as a man perpetually misunderstood by authorities, punished once for the Pendorf case, and now unfairly linked to acts committed by others. Federal agents saw it differently. To them, the letter was a sign that he remained in or near Chicago, confident enough in his support network to send mail under his own name. It also previewed the arguments his defense would later make in court, that his age, prior convictions, and purported retirement from crime should cast doubt on his present culpability. Shortly after New Year's Day 2006, a break came. Acting on a lead, FBI agents and Chicago police set up surveillance in a neighborhood on the city's northwest side. They watched movements in and out of a particular home, noting faces, license plates, and patterns. On January 13, they moved in. Near an alley not far from the house under watch, agents confronted an older man and a younger companion. The older man gave an alias, but fingerprints and soon, the recognition of some officers on the scene confirmed what they already believed. They had found Joseph Lombardo. Television coverage of his arrest showed a man who looked every one of his 76 years. His hair was white, his shoulders slightly stooped. Yet when he was brought into court for his initial appearance, the familiar half-smile returned. Reporters in the gallery noted that he scanned the room as if amused by the attention, whispering with an attorney and waving briefly toward acquaintances. Whatever privations he had endured while hiding, he showed no visible signs of panic. He pleaded not guilty to the charges and was ordered held without bond pending trial. Pretrial proceedings in the family secrets case were lengthy and complex. Defense attorneys filed a barrage of motions challenging various aspects of the indictment. Lombardo's legal team argued that prosecuting him now for the Seifert murder violated the constitutional prohibition against double jeopardy, since he had been acquitted of related charges in the mid-1970s. Prosecutors countered that the new case was legally distinct. The 1970s trial had focused on fraud against the pension fund, not on murder to prevent testimony, and RICO allowed them to pursue an overarching conspiracy that incorporated acts never before presented to a jury. Judge Zagel, after reviewing the prior proceedings and relevant case law, agreed with the government and denied the motion, clearing the way for Seyfert's death to be considered as part of the racketeering pattern. Other motions hinged on Lombardo's age and health. His attorneys pointed out that he suffered from heart problems and other ailments common in men approaching 80. They suggested that forcing him to stand trial alongside younger, more physically robust co-defendants in a sprawling case would be unduly harsh and prejudicial. The court acknowledged his health issues, but noted that federal detention facilities were equipped to provide necessary care. The alleged seriousness of the charges, Zagel wrote, outweighed his arguments for separate proceedings or delay. The trial would go forward with Lombardo seated among the other remaining defendants: Frank Calabrese Sr., James Marcello, Paul Schiro, and Anthony Doyle, a former Chicago police officer accused of protecting outfit interests. In June 2007, jury selection began. Prospective jurors were questioned at length about their familiarity with organized crime cases, their attitudes toward law enforcement, and their ability to weigh evidence concerning events that, in some instances, had occurred before they were born. Once a jury was impaneled, the trial opened with an outline from the prosecution that spanned 4 decades. Assistant U.S. attorneys described the outfit as a hierarchical enterprise that had used fear, violence, and corrupt relationships to maintain its grip on illegal gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. They spoke of code names and street taxes, of hidden graves and motel meetings, and of a code of silence enforced with relentless determination. Within that narrative, Lombardo was cast as a key player in the outfit's West Side operations, and as a participant in at least one killing designed to protect the organization's secrets. In their opening remarks, prosecutors revisited the story of Daniel Seyfert, the young plastics company owner who, faced with a federal indictment in the early 1970s, had agreed to testify about a scheme involving Teamsters' pension money. They told the jurors about the morning at Seyfert's Bensonville factory when armed men had attacked him in front of his family. They promised that witnesses, including Seyfert's widow, would identify Lombardo as one of the masked assailants, and that cooperating insiders would explain why Seyfert had been considered too dangerous to leave alive. The heart of the government's case lay in testimony from those insiders. Chief among them was Nicholas Calabrese, the former hitman whose cooperation had unlocked the family secrets investigation. Over several days on the stand, Calabrese described his induction into the outfit, the rules he was taught, and the murders he carried out or witnessed. In measured, sometimes halting language, he recounted events that had lived for decades only in whispers and in the quiet grief of victims' families. He named accomplices, sketched the roles of crew bosses, and explained how decisions about life and death were made. When the questioning turned to the Seyfert case, Calabrese placed Lombardo among those involved in planning and directing the attack. He described meetings at which the risk posed by Seyfert's cooperation was discussed and orders relayed. His account, built on a mix of personal recollection and what he had been told at the time, aligned with other pieces of the government's puzzle: phone records, surveillance reports, and the timing of legal motions in the 1970s fraud case that had abruptly lost its key witness. Calabrese was not the only crucial witness. Seyfert's widow, Emma, took the stand to recount the morning her husband was killed. In clear, resolute testimony, she described masked men entering the property, the panic that ensued, and a moment when one assailant's disguise slipped enough for her to see his face. She told the jury she recognized him as Joseph Lombardo, a man who had previously visited the family under friendlier pretenses. Her identification, disputed vigorously by the defense, provided an emotional and direct link between Lombardo and the scene of the crime. FBI agents and Chicago detectives supplemented these accounts with a more clinical view of Lombardo's activities. They walked the jury through decades of surveillance, photographs of him meeting with known outfit leaders, notes from traffic stops where he had been in the company of other suspects, financial records suggesting control over certain businesses. They explained how the outfit structure, as they understood it, placed Lombardo at the head of the Grand Avenue crew during critical periods. Together, this testimony aimed to show not just that he had once committed a serious crime, but that he had done so as part of a continuing enterprise that persisted well into the years covered by the indictment. Lombardo's defense leaned on a few central themes. His attorneys argued that the government's case depended too heavily on the words of cooperating criminals, men with powerful incentives to shift blame and please prosecutors. They suggested that Nicholas Calabrese, facing a potential life sentence, might exaggerate or misremember Lombardo's role to lessen his own punishment. They stressed that the Seifert murder had occurred more than 30 years earlier, making eyewitness identification inherently unreliable. They also maintained that, after his release from prison in the early 1990s, Lombardo had genuinely retired from any criminal activity, becoming what one defense filing called a grandfather and pensioner, not a criminal mastermind. At several points, Lombardo himself became an active presence in the defense. Early in the proceedings, he expressed a desire to represent himself, a right that federal law allows under certain conditions. Judge Zagel, wary of the complexity of RICO law and Lombardo's health, ultimately required that experienced counsel remain at his side, but did permit him some leeway to participate directly in cross-examination. In one memorable exchange, he asked a witness whether they had ever personally seen him commit an act of violence. The witness replied that they had not, prompting Lombardo to nod as if scoring a point. To the prosecution, such questions missed the broader issue. The case concerned not only who pulled triggers but who authorized and facilitated the crimes. Throughout the trial, observers were struck by the contrast between the gravity of the charges and Lombardo's occasional flashes of levity. He smiled at courtroom sketches of himself, joked softly with marshals, and once donned oversized glasses in a way that made some spectators chuckle. Yet those moments could not alter the underlying calculus. The evidence was detailed and cumulative, built not on a single dramatic revelation, but on the steady accretion of corroborating pieces assembled over years of investigation. After more than 2 months of testimony, the case went to the jury. Deliberations stretched across days as jurors sifted through counts involving 5 defendants, 18 murders, and a host of related racketeering acts. On September 10, 2007, they returned to the courtroom with their verdicts. The judge asked the foreperson to rise. One by one, as each defendant's name and each count were read, the answers came: guilty. Joseph Lombardo was convicted of racketeering conspiracy and related charges. More specifically, the jury found that the government had proven his role in the 1974 murder of Daniel Seifert as part of the outfit's pattern of activity. In the eyes of the law, the verdict closed a circle begun more than 30 years earlier, when Seifert agreed to testify and was killed before he could speak in open court. Now, through the combined words of his widow, a former hitman, and a host of investigators, his story had finally been heard and credited by a jury. For Seifert's family, the verdict brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. Outside the courthouse, his widow spoke briefly to reporters, acknowledging that no legal outcome could erase what had happened, but expressing gratitude that, at last, someone had been held accountable. Lombardo's relatives, by contrast, maintained that the government had built its case on unreliable testimony, and that an old man was being punished more for his reputation than for any proven act. The split in perception echoed a long-standing divide in Chicago itself, between those who viewed Lombardo as a symbol of a corrosive criminal culture, and those who, for various reasons, saw him as a neighborhood figure caught in a web of overreaching prosecutions. Sentencing hearings followed over the next year, as Judge Zagel weighed punishment for each defendant. For Lombardo, the stakes were stark. Federal sentencing guidelines taking into account murder as part of a racketeering conspiracy pointed toward life imprisonment. Prosecutors argued that his long career within the outfit, His central role in operations and his involvement in silencing a witness justified the maximum penalty. They noted that, while many of the crimes had been committed years earlier, their effects remained. Families without fathers, cases corrupted by fear, a union's funds diverted from the workers they were meant to serve. Lombardo's defense asked the court to consider his advanced age and health. He was approaching 80 by the time of sentencing, with documented heart disease and other ailments. His attorneys suggested that a term of years, even if substantial, would suffice to reflect the seriousness of the offenses while acknowledging his limited remaining lifespan. They reiterated his claims of non-involvement in the murders, pointing to the lack of physical evidence tying him to Seyfert's death and questioning the motives of key witnesses. When his turn came to address the court, Lombardo spoke in a tone that mixed defiance with a curious form of courtesy. He denied ever having been a made member of any criminal organization, insisted he had not killed or ordered the killing of anyone, and expressed sympathy for victims' families while denying responsibility for their losses. He framed himself, as he had done in previous public statements, as a working man caught up in a narrative shaped by others. Judge Zagel listened, then delivered a carefully reasoned response. He acknowledged Lombardo's age but emphasized that the crimes at issue were not youthful mistakes. They were, the judge said, the acts of a mature man who had chosen, over and over, to align himself with an organization that relied on intimidation and killing to preserve its power. The law, he concluded, did not permit him to treat such conduct lightly merely because the defendant had managed to avoid conviction for many years. He sentenced Joseph Lombardo to life in prison. The sentence effectively drew a legal curtain over Lombardo's long run as a free man in Chicago, a figure who had navigated the shifting landscape of organized crime from the tail end of Prohibition through the era of Las Vegas casinos, union scandals, and casino prosecutions. Now faced the prospect of spending his remaining years behind the walls of a federal penitentiary. For law enforcement officials who had pursued him across decades, the outcome represented both a personal and institutional vindication. For historians and observers of Chicago's underworld, it marked the beginning of the final chapter in the life of a man whose story intertwined with some of the city's darkest and most enduring secrets. Once the sentence was pronounced and the last of the cameras were ushered from the courtroom, Joseph Lombardo's world narrowed abruptly. The man who had spent decades moving through taverns, union halls, and back rooms across Chicago was placed in the custody of the Bureau of Prisons, his days suddenly defined by schedules, counts, and locked doors. He was nearly 80 when marshals led him down the hall from Judge James Zagel's courtroom after the family secret's sentencing. Reporters caught a glimpse of him as he passed, the faint, habitual half-smile still there, but his shoulders bowed and his steps small. For all his bravado in the weeks before, there was no mistaking the reality now. A life sentence for a man his age meant exactly what it sounded like. In the months that followed, Lombardo was processed through the federal system, evaluated for health, security risk, and institutional placement. Given the nature of his conviction, racketeering conspiracy involving murder, and his central role in a long-running criminal enterprise, he was classified at the highest security level. Eventually, he was transferred to one of the most restrictive facilities in the country, the federal supermax in Florence, Colorado. There, far from the streets and alleys of his youth, he became inmate number 84,379-024, residing in a small concrete cell behind a solid metal door, his physical world reduced to a bed, a desk, a toilet, and a narrow slit of window admitting light and a fragment of sky. Life at such a prison is deliberately monotonous. Inmates spend most of each day alone in their cells. Meals are slid through slots in the doors. Recreation, when granted, often consists of an hour in a small, caged space, sometimes alone there as well. Human contact is limited. Brief exchanges with guards, short visits from attorneys, occasional family visits conducted through thick glass and telephones, strictly monitored letters and monitored phone calls. For a man whose career had depended on face-to-face conversations, social nuance, and the ability to read and influence people in real time, the isolation must have represented a profound change. Yet, consistent with his long-standing refusal to reveal inner doubts to authorities, there is no record of him publicly expressing regret about the path that brought him there. What Lombardo did continue to express, through his attorneys and in legal filings, was his insistence that he had been wrongly convicted. Almost as soon as the family secrets trial ended, defense lawyers set about preparing an appeal. They raised familiar arguments that prosecuting him for the Seifert murder violated protections against double jeopardy, that the government had relied too heavily on testimony from cooperating criminals, that the jury had been presented with an unfairly broad picture of the outfit that made it impossible to separate individual guilt from the enterprise's history. They contended that identification testimony from events 3 decades in the past was inherently unreliable, and that the trial court had erred in certain rulings on evidence and jury instructions. In 2010, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit issued its decision. In a lengthy opinion covering all of the family secrets defendants, the panel upheld the convictions. On the double jeopardy issue, the court agreed with Judge Zagel. The earlier 1970s case had centered on fraud against the Teamsters Pension Fund, while the new charges focused on murder as part of a broader racketeering scheme. They were legally distinct offenses. As for the credibility of witnesses like Nicholas Calabrese, the court noted that cross-examination and corroborating evidence had given jurors sufficient tools to evaluate those accounts, and that it was not the appellate court's role to second-guess the jury's weighing of testimony. The pattern of evidence, the judges concluded, supported the conclusion that Lombardo had been a significant participant in the outfit's criminal enterprise and in the Seifert murder. Lombardo petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court to review the case, but in 2011 the court declined to hear it, letting the lower court's ruling stand. For all practical purposes, his legal avenues narrowed to the thinnest of possibilities, specialized motions that very rarely overturn such convictions. He pursued some of those remedies, habeas petitions and related filings, but none gained serious traction. Each denial reinforced a reality that had been clear since the day of sentencing. Barring profound and unlikely changes in the law, he would die in federal custody. Inside prison, Lombardo settled into a routine that, for all its restrictions, contained familiar elements. Like many long-term inmates, he gravitated toward the law library when permitted, poring over casebooks and federal reporters. Guards and other prisoners later recalled that he offered advice on legal questions to those who sought him out, sketching out strategies for appeals and pointing them toward relevant precedents. This was not new behavior. He had done much the same during his earlier stint behind bars after the Pendorf conviction. In an environment where formal education was limited and access to lawyers often sporadic, a man who could decipher legal opinions commanded a certain kind of respect. He also maintained contact, as far as prison rules allowed, with family and a small circle of longtime acquaintances. Phone calls were short and monitored, but they carried traces of the personality that had made him so memorable in Chicago courtrooms. Relatives would later say that he tried to keep conversations light, asking about children and grandchildren, making small jokes about his own condition, downplaying health problems. He inquired about news from the old neighborhoods, who had passed away, who had moved, which businesses were still open. To those on the outside, it could be easy to forget in moments like that the inmate on the other end of the line had spent decades at the center of a system that enforced its will through fear, and when necessary, deadly force. If Lombardo experienced deeper reflections about his life, they remained largely private. Unlike some figures from organized crime history who later co-authored memoirs or granted lengthy interviews from prison, he never set down a public account of his own. That silence was consistent with the code he had followed since his youth. Cooperation with authorities, whether in the form of testimony or confessional writing, was anathema in the outfit's culture. Even as his body aged and his prospects dwindled, he did not break that code. Prosecutors and agents, some of whom might have welcomed a fuller account of unsolved crimes, heard nothing from him beyond legal arguments about the cases already on the books. Outside the prison walls, the world he had helped shape in Chicago evolved. The family secrets convictions, combined with earlier blows from the Las Vegas skimming cases and Teamsters prosecutions, left the outfit a reduced shadow of its mid-century self. Many of the most senior figures were dead or incarcerated. Younger members and associates took on more responsibility, but they did so in a landscape now heavily monitored by federal and local law enforcement. Gambling had migrated to legal casinos in Illinois and neighboring states, diminishing the underground share of that market. The internet era transformed sports betting, creating new gray areas that, while exploitable, also generated fresh trails of digital evidence. Law enforcement officials described the transition in interviews over the following years. The outfit, they said, had not vanished, but it operated more cautiously, with smaller crews and lower-profile schemes. Loan sharking and protection rackets persisted in some corners. Video gambling machines remained under quiet mob influence in certain jurisdictions, and construction contracts could still be steered through informal pressure. But the era of outfit bosses moving millions through Las Vegas casinos or controlling vast swaths of union pension funds appeared to have ended. Many in law enforcement attributed that in part to the cumulative effect of the RICO cases, with family secrets as a key milestone. Removing figures like Lombardo from the streets disrupted networks that had taken decades to build. For families of victims whose loved ones' deaths had formed part of the family secrets case, the passing years brought a different kind of adjustment. Some found a measure of peace in knowing that those they held responsible, Lombardo among them, would not walk free again. They attended annual memorial services, joined support networks, or spoke occasionally to journalists and historians trying to understand the human toll of the outfit's long reign. Others remained wary of public attention, unwilling to reopen wounds by revisiting events that had torn their families apart. For all of them, the fact that a former West Side Street kid had risen to become one of the men sitting in the dock for those crimes underscored how thoroughly the city's criminal structures had been woven into ordinary lives. Within academic and journalistic circles, Lombardo's story began to be folded into a broader reassessment of organized crime in America. Historians traced his trajectory alongside those of other mid-century mob figures, noting how immigration, urban poverty, political corruption, and shifting law enforcement tactics had intersected in their careers. In this literature, Lombardo often appeared as a representative of a particular generation. Men born around the Great Depression, raised in tight ethnic neighborhoods, schooled in an unwritten code that prized loyalty and distrust of outside authority. Over time, they had adapted from the rougher street violence of earlier decades to more complex, financially driven schemes, while still relying on the underlying threat of force. Writers differed in how they interpreted his refusal to cooperate, even when faced with a life sentence. Some saw it as proof of deep-seated commitment to the outfit's ethos, a sign that the code of silence retained real power over certain men of his era. Others viewed it more practically. He was in his 80s by the time the last appeals failed, with little realistic possibility of a reduced sentence even if he did talk. A lifetime's habits, keeping one's own counsel, minimizing admissions, maintaining a certain posture of defiance, were not easily cast aside. Whatever his internal motivations, the outward facts were clear. He never turned state's evidence, never testified against old associates, never publicly acknowledged membership in the organization that law enforcement and the courts had spent decades demonstrating he served. Back in Chicago, his name remained a kind of shorthand. For some, Joey the Clown evoked the courthouse antics and colorful headlines, the newspaper with eye holes, the quips to reporters. For others, particularly those acquainted with the cases or with victims' families, the nickname grated. It seemed to trivialize the serious consequences of the acts linked to him. Prosecutors and agents, when interviewed on anniversaries of the family secrets trial, emphasized that behind the almost cartoonish moniker was a man who, by their account and that of the courts, had been intimately involved in decisions that led to loss of life and profound disruption in working-class communities. As he aged in custody, news about Lombardo surfaced only intermittently. An occasional motion would be filed on his behalf, citing new health issues or seeking adjustments in conditions of confinement. Those filings, when public, confirmed what the calendar already suggested. He was in his 80s now, with the typical ailments of advanced age layered atop the stresses of incarceration. Federal prisons have medical centers that provide treatment and palliative care, but they are not designed to resemble hospitals on the outside. Facilities like the one in Florence, especially, exist first as instruments of confinement. In that setting, heart disease, diabetes, and other chronic conditions are managed against a backdrop of concrete, steel, and strict regimentation. There is no record of Lombardo making grand speeches or seeking to reinterpret his life for posterity in these years. The closest approximation came in the form of short statements attached to legal filings or relayed through counsel, reiterating his long-standing claims that he had never been a made member of the outfit, that he had not committed or ordered the murders for which he was convicted, that he had already paid society through his earlier sentence and was now being punished for events too old and too diffuse to be fairly adjudicated. The courts showed little sympathy for these arguments, but in repeating them, he maintained an internal consistency that had marked his public posture since at least the 1970s. For those who had followed his story over the decades, there was a certain starkness in the contrast between beginning and near end. The boy born to immigrant parents on Chicago's West Side in 1929 had grown up in neighborhoods where the outfit's presence was visible but not always fully understood, then climbed within its ranks to become a man whose decisions influenced where money flowed, who prospered, and who fell afoul of an unforgiving system. Now, in the 2010s, he passed his days largely alone in a cell hundreds of miles from the city that had defined him, his power reduced to the contents of his mind, and the small sphere of influence he could exercise through occasional letters and phone calls. Yet even in that reduced state, his name carried echoes. When new books on the Chicago mob were published, they often featured his photograph. Television documentaries about organized crime threaded clips of him walking into court, smirking at cameras, or sitting at counsel table beside younger co-defendants. Scholars and journalists used his life as a lens through which to examine broader questions. How did organized crime embed itself so deeply in civic life? Why did certain neighborhoods produce so many men drawn into that world? What did it mean that, for decades, a parallel power structure had existed alongside official institutions, sometimes in quiet collusion, sometimes in tense competition? Lombardo himself could not shape those conversations. He remained, as he had been for much of his career, an object of scrutiny rather than a participant in the narrative. The archival record of his life, court records, FBI files, newspaper coverage, and the testimony of those who had known or opposed him continued to grow even as his personal world contracted. In that sense, the years after his final conviction represent a kind of paradox. The man became more circumscribed, more contained. The story bearing his name expanded, woven into the larger history of a city and an era. As the decade wore on, time exerted its inescapable pressure. The companions of Lombardo's youth and middle age, those who had once stood with him on Chicago sidewalks or at the back tables of restaurants, died one by one or slipped into obscurity. The outfit they had served persisted in altered form, its activities less visible, its leaders less notorious. New generations in Chicago grew up knowing Joey the Clown, not as a living presence in their neighborhoods, but as a character in documentaries or a name in true crime books, a symbol of a chapter of the city's life that felt, to them, already halfway consigned to history. Inside a heavily secured federal facility in Colorado, the man at the center of that symbol lived out his final years largely apart from those shifting perceptions, his story moving steadily toward its close, even as debates about its meaning continued beyond the prison walls. In the last years of Joseph Lombardo's life, the routines of federal custody settled into a kind of austere rhythm. The days were governed by institutional time, early counts, meal deliveries, brief opportunities for exercise, medical checks. There were no late-night meetings in tavern back rooms, no impromptu gatherings in union halls, no sidelong glances exchanged in the corners of courtrooms. Instead, there was the slow erosion that comes with age, especially age spent under the physical and psychological pressures of a maximum security regime. For a man who had once measured his influence in the nods of crew members and the flows of cash through hidden channels, power now consisted of the few things still under his control: how he responded to staff, which books he read, the tone he used on monitored phone calls with the people who remained in his life. By his mid-80s, Lombardo's health had deteriorated in ways that were no surprise to doctors or prison officials. Years of smoking and stress, combined with the ordinary toll of time, produced heart and respiratory problems. The Bureau of Prisons runs specialized medical facilities for inmates with serious or chronic conditions, and eventually it was decided that his needs could no longer be adequately managed at a supermax. He was transferred to the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, a sprawling compound that functions as the system's main hospital for male inmates. There, high fences and guard towers coexist with exam rooms, wards, and therapy areas. The environment remained a prison in every legal and practical sense, but the daily focus shifted from strict isolation to medical management. Inside the medical center, Lombardo joined a population made up not only of high-profile convicts from organized crime and terrorism cases, but also of aging bank robbers, drug offenders, and men whose names had never appeared in a newspaper. In that setting, his history did not grant him many privileges. Security classifications still mattered, of course, and the seriousness of his crimes limited his freedom of movement even within the institution. But illness has its own leveling effect. Patients ate in common areas under close supervision, shuffled to appointments along the same corridors, lined up at the same dispensaries for medication. To new staffers and some fellow inmates, many of whom were too young to remember the heyday of the Chicago outfit, he was as likely to be seen as an elderly prisoner with a complicated medical chart as the man once described by prosecutors as a key cog in a murderous enterprise. Yet his past was never entirely absent. Guards with longer tenure knew who he was. Occasionally, a visiting official or investigator touring the facility as part of some inspection or conference would glance at a roster and recognize the name. From time to time, journalists working on books or retrospective pieces about the family secrets case placed requests to interview him. These were declined. He had spent a lifetime minimizing what he said to outsiders about his activities, and there is no evidence that he chose to break that habit now. Whatever thoughts he might have had about the path that had brought him from Chicago's near West Side to a prison hospital in Missouri remained between him, his closest relatives, and perhaps a few confidants among the inmates. On October 19, 2019, those routines came to an end. Joseph Lombardo died at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield at the age of 90. The Bureau of Prisons announced his death in the standard, restrained language it uses in such cases, noting only the date, his age, his inmate number, and the fact that life-saving measures had been attempted. Authorities did not issue a detailed public explanation of the cause, but contemporary reporting described it as death from natural causes associated with his advanced age and ongoing health issues. There were no dramatic final statements, no last-minute revelations about unsolved crimes. His passing, as far as the public record shows, was medically unremarkable, a quiet conclusion to a life that had unfolded, for decades, amid intense and often violent conflict. News of his death reached Chicago within hours. Local newspapers published obituaries that reviewed his history: the West Side childhood, the rise through the Grand Avenue crew, the Pendorf bribery case, the years as a fugitive, the family secrets trial and life sentence. Wire services carried shorter bulletins, noting simply that a one-time Chicago mob figure had died in federal custody. For younger readers, the name may have meant little, another relic of a bygone era. For those who had lived through the 1970s and 1980s, however, it stirred memories of headlines about corrupt pension deals, slain witnesses, and Las Vegas skimming schemes. Television news programs reused archival footage: Lombardo shielding his face with a newspaper cut into a crude mask, Lombardo walking briskly into the Dirksen courthouse, Lombardo seated at defense table, older and thinner but still quick with a faint, ironic smile. Retired law enforcement officials were called for comment. Some had spent much of their careers trying to assemble cases against him. They spoke, generally in measured tones, about his skill at staying one step removed from overt criminal acts, about his ability to project charm even when under indictment, about the frustration of watching earlier prosecutions collapse when key witnesses refused to testify, or, in the case of Daniel Safer, were killed. Several emphasized that, in their view, the family secrets convictions had finally aligned legal outcomes with what years of investigative work had suggested about responsibility for those crimes. His death in prison, they said, was not a cause for celebration so much as confirmation that the justice system, however delayed, had ultimately imposed some measure of accountability. For families of victims whose names had appeared in the family secrets indictment, Seifert among them, the news carried a different resonance. Some spoke cautiously to reporters. They noted that his death did not bring back husbands, fathers, or brothers. It did not erase the nights of fear after those killings, the years of raising children alone, the sense that the city's institutions had for too long failed to protect them or to punish those responsible. At the same time, there was a sense of closure. The man whom the courts had found complicit in their loved ones' deaths would not be returning to Chicago. There would be no parole hearings to attend, no renewed media circuses around possible releases. An era, for better and worse, had truly ended. Within the Italian-American communities where he had grown up and later moved, reactions were mixed and often private. Some older residents remembered him as a neighborhood presence before he became infamous. A familiar face at weddings, a man seen chatting on street corners, someone whose rumored connections lent an air of danger but also, perversely, of protection. Others took pains to distinguish between ethnic identity and the criminal world he had inhabited, frustrated that figures like Lombardo had come, in some public imaginations, to stand in for an entire community. In conversations over coffee in suburban diners or family kitchens, people told stories, some admiring, some appalled, many ambivalent, about the ways the outfit had once been woven into their everyday lives, and about the costs of that entanglement. In the years after his death, Joseph Lombardo's name continued to surface in books, documentaries, and academic studies. For criminologists and historians, his life provided a dense case study in the evolution of organized crime from the mid-20th century into the new millennium. His career spanned key phases: the shift from Prohibition-era bootlegging to gambling and labor racketeering, the infiltration of unions and pension funds, the expansion into Las Vegas casinos, the long struggle between local law enforcement and increasingly sophisticated criminal networks, and finally, the federal government's embrace of tools like RICO and long-term witness protection that allowed it to reach into the upper tiers of organizations once thought untouchable. Analysts pointed out how his story illustrated both continuity and change. In his youth, the outfit's authority was asserted through conspicuous acts of violence in the streets of Chicago's near West Side and the western suburbs. By the time he reached middle age, the violence remained, but much of the real power had shifted into boardrooms and back offices, into the manipulation of contracts, the steering of loans, the quiet intimidation of regulators and business partners. Lombardo was present at each stage, adapting as needed, learning the language of finance and politics while never completely abandoning the older methods of enforcement when they were deemed necessary. At the same time, scholars cautioned against treating him as a solitary mastermind. The Chicago outfit was a network, not a one-man show. Lombardo rose within structures that predated his birth and persisted, in altered form, after his incarceration. His path was shaped by factors beyond his control: the poverty of his childhood, the discrimination faced by Italian immigrants, the deep-rooted corruption of Chicago's political machine, the long-standing overlap between ward politics and underworld enforcement. None of these absolve him of responsibility for the choices he made. They do, however, complicate simplistic narratives of individual villainy divorced from social context. Conversely, writers sympathetic to law enforcement emphasize that decisions by men like Lombardo were not inevitable products of circumstance. Thousands of young Italian-American men in mid-century Chicago grew up in similar conditions and did not join the outfit. They worked in factories, opened small businesses, or pursued education. To them, the enduring power of the underworld was not a given but something resisted, sometimes at real personal cost. From this perspective, Lombardo's life underscored the reality that agency and environment operate together. He was both a product of his time and a person who repeatedly chose to use his talents for intimidation and illicit gain rather than for lawful enterprise. The question of remorse hovered at the edges of these discussions. Because Lombardo never publicly expressed regret or offered a candid account of his actions, commentators were left to speculate. Some argued that his silence was simply a matter of self-protection and ingrained habit. Others saw in it a more troubling possibility: that he did not, at a fundamental level, see his behavior as wrong in the same way his critics did, viewing law enforcement as the enemy and the outfit as a parallel system with its own internal logic of loyalty, obligation, and reward. The truth, inaccessible in the absence of a personal confession, remained one of the family secrets the case's nickname had invoked, a reminder that even the most exhaustive investigations can leave some inner landscapes unexplored. Looking back across his 90 years, the arc is stark. Born in 1929 to immigrant parents in a neighborhood marked by hardship and close-knit community ties, Joseph Lombardo came of age in a city where the line between legal and illegal power structures was often blurred. As a young man, he gravitated toward the outfit's West Side operations, proving himself useful in low-level roles and gradually ascending into positions of authority. He cultivated an image, funny, approachable, almost self-parodying at times, that helped mask the severity of the decisions he was involved in making. Over decades, he navigated multiple prosecutions, serving time when necessary, maintaining silence about others, and emerging often with his standing inside the organization preserved or even enhanced. In the end, the very qualities that had allowed him to survive so long, his capacity for discretion, his willingness to accept punishment without cooperation, his skill at deflecting direct responsibility, could not indefinitely outweigh the accumulation of evidence. The slow, painstaking work of investigators, the willingness of insiders like Nicholas Calabrese to break the long-standing code, and the structural evolution of federal law combined to expose and punish acts that had, for years, seemed beyond the reach of courts. His life sentence and eventual death in prison symbolized, for many in law enforcement, the closing of a generational chapter in the battle against organized crime. For Chicago itself, his story remains woven into a larger, often uneasy narrative. The city's identity has long been shaped by dualities: reformers and machine politicians, skyscrapers and tenements, proud civic rhetoric and enduring patterns of corruption. Lombardo's life sat at the intersection of many of these tensions. He thrived in spaces where political power and underworld influence overlapped, where union ideals of worker solidarity were exploited for private profit, where the mythology of the tough but charming neighborhood figure obscured the depth of the harm inflicted on individuals and institutions alike. In the years since his death, as new generations grow up at a distance from the days when the outfit loomed large in daily news, Joseph Lombardo has taken on a slightly different role in the public imagination. He is no longer a contemporary antagonist but a historical figure, his image frozen in grainy courtroom photographs and black and white mug shots. Documentaries recount his exploits with the detachment of hindsight, placing him alongside other names in a lineage of American organized crime. Scholars dissect his cases to explain how doctrines like RICO transformed the legal landscape. Teachers use his story to spark discussions about ethics, social mobility, and the long reach of institutional corruption. Yet beneath these layers of analysis and representation, the core remains simple. A boy from a working-class immigrant family chose, early in life, to align himself with a criminal organization that promised power and wealth in exchange for loyalty and a willingness to bend or break the law. He rose high in that world, reaped its rewards, outlasted many of his peers, and ultimately paid with his freedom, and indirectly with the way his life would be remembered. The neighborhoods he walked as a child, the city whose politics and economy he helped distort, the union members whose pension money became a tool in schemes he supported, and the families who lost loved ones in acts of violence linked to the outfit, all bear some trace, however faint now, of his passage. Joseph Lombardo did not write his own epitaph. History, pieced together from court records, investigative files, journalistic accounts, and the memories of those who encountered him, has done that work instead. It presents a portrait neither wholly monstrous nor in any sense exonerating. A complex, often contradictory man whose personal charm coexisted with participation in a system built on fear, whose intelligence and adaptability could have taken many forms but were applied, again and again, in service of an enterprise that damaged countless lives. In that tension between person and pattern lies much of the enduring fascination and the cautionary weight of his story.